Good evening, and welcome to the Sleepy Biographer. Tonight, we're not just remembering history. We're drifting through the quiet story of a life that became legend. A boy who became an outlaw. A soldier who never stopped fighting. A man whose name would echo through American folklore for more than a century after his death. You've got nothing to do but rest. Let your breathing slow, and your thoughts grow light, as if the weight of the day is finally lifting. Because tonight, we aren't simply learning about an outlaw. We're walking beside him, through the farmlands of Missouri, through the smoke of guerrilla warfare, through the dusty streets of frontier towns, and through the creation of a myth that would outlive the man himself. Jesse Woodson. James was not just a bank robber. He was a product of his time, shaped by violence and loss, by the bitter divisions of a nation at war with itself. He was a son, a brother, a husband, and a father. He was praised as a hero by some, and condemned as a murderer by others. And the truth, as always, lies somewhere in the spaces between the stories. Some of what you hear tonight may surprise you. Some may challenge what you thought you knew. But mostly, I hope it helps you drift gently into sleep, cradled by the rhythm of a life lived on the edge of legend and tragedy. And just before we begin, if these calm, curious explorations help you unwind or give you a quiet way to end your day, consider liking and subscribing to the channel. It helps others find their way here too, one sleepy soul at a time. You already know him. That's the strange thing. Even if you've never read a single book about Jesse James, you carry a version of him somewhere in the back of your mind. The dashing rider, the gentleman bandit, the man on the dark horse who took from the railroads and the banks, those great cold machines that crushed the small farmer and handed it quietly back to the poor. A Robin Hood in a slouch hat, a rebel with a southern drawl, and a code of honor. That's the legend. And it's a beautiful one. In the legend, he never shot a man who didn't deserve it. In the legend, the widow about to lose her farm is saved by a mysterious stranger who pays off her mortgage, then waits down the road to rob the banker who came to collect. In the legend, Jesse is always smiling, always one step ahead, always somehow on the right side of a wrong world. People wanted to believe it. They still do. By the time he died, there were children in Missouri who'd never seen his face, but could tell you what he stood for. Dime novels stacked up on general store counters with his name across the cover in letters an inch tall. He was the Confederate cavalier who'd never surrendered. The avenger of a defeated South. The honest outlaw in a country full of dishonest men in fine suits. And here is the part that should make you pause, even as you're drifting off. Much of that story, the Robin Hood part, the noble part, the part where he gives to the poor, there's almost no evidence it ever happened. Not really. Not in the way the legend insists. There is no documented case of Jesse James paying off a widow's mortgage. None. It's a tale that gets attached to outlaws the way barnacles attach to a hull. Old, repeated, comforting, and untrue. So who built the legend, if not the facts? We'll get there. Be patient. The man who invented the Robin Hood of the West was not Jesse himself, though he certainly didn't mind it, but a newspaper man, with a wounded heart and a gift for words. We'll meet him later, when the night is darker. For now, just hold both pictures in your mind at once. The hero of the ballads, and somewhere behind him, harder to see, a young man with cold blue eyes and a habit of violence that began long before the first bank. Because the real story doesn't start with a robbery. It starts on a farm. A farm with a porch and a hemp field, and people held in bondage at the edge of it. Let's walk back there now. The road is quiet. The night is soft. Come and see where he actually came from. Picture western Missouri in the late 1840s. Rolling country, green and humid in the summer, the soil rich and dark. This is the western edge of what people called Little Dixie, a band of counties settled mostly by Southerners who'd come up from Kentucky and Tennessee and Virginia, bringing their crops and their churches, and their slaves, with them. Jesse Woodson. James was born here, in Clay County, on the 5th of September, 1847. His father was a man named Robert Sally James, and right away, the legend wobbles, because Robert was not some hard-scrabble dirt farmer scraping by. He was a Baptist minister, an educated man, a founder of churches, a man who helped establish a college, a man who could read scripture in the original and quote it from memory. He preached. He farmed hemp, which in those days meant rope and sailcloth, a serious cash crop. And he owned human beings to work that land. That's the uncomfortable truth at the foundation of the James family. They were slaveholders, comfortable ones. Not the poor, oppressed yeoman of the Robin Hood myth, but a prosperous, church-going, slave-owning family on the Missouri frontier. Jesse's mother was Zerelda. Remember her. She matters more than almost anyone in this story. Zerelda. Cole was tall, close to 6 feet, people said, sharp-tongued, fierce, fearless, and absolutely devoted to her children, with a ferocity that bordered on the terrifying. She was a force. She would outlive her famous son by decades, and she would never, not once, soften the story of what was done to her family. We'll come back to her too. There was an older brother, Frank. Alexander Franklin James, born in 1843, 4 years ahead of Jesse. Quiet, where Jesse could be quick. A reader. Frank loved Shakespeare his whole life, could recite long passages of it, and would still be quoting the bard as an old man working odd jobs decades after the gang was gone. The two brothers would be bound together until the very end, through the war, the robberies, the running, all of it. And then, when Jesse was just 3 years old, his father left. It was 1850. The California gold rush had swept the country like a fever, and Robert James went west to preach to the miners, the family always said, though the lure of gold may have whispered too. Whatever called him, he never came back. He died out there in California that same year. Fever, most likely. Jesse never really knew him. He was a name, a memory, a gap where a father should have been. So the household became Zerelda's. She married again, twice in fact. The first remarriage was brief and unhappy. The second, in 1855, was to a quiet doctor named Reuben Samuel, a gentle man content to live in his formidable wife's shadow. He moved into the farm. He became, by all accounts, a kind and steady stepfather. And the household kept growing, half-siblings arriving, the farm filling with children. So sit for a moment with the real childhood. Not poverty, not oppression. A working farm, a devout and domineering mother, a mild stepfather, an adored older brother, scripture at the table, and enslaved people working the fields a few yards from the porch where the children played. It was, in its way, a comfortable boyhood. Jesse went to church. He learned his letters. He was known as a cheerful boy, even a religious one. He was baptized, took his faith seriously, would carry a kind of Old Testament conviction with him for the rest of his short life. There's a detail here that stays with me. As a teenager, Jesse developed a chronic eye ailment that made him blink, constantly, almost compulsively. Granulated eyelids, they called it. It gave him a permanent twitch, a fluttering squint, the terror of 3 states, and he couldn't keep his eyes from blinking. Hold that boy in your mind. The hemp fields, the blinking, the mother who loved fiercely, and the father who vanished into the gold country and never returned. Because that world, that whole green, prosperous, slave-holding world, was about to be set on fire. And Jesse James would learn how to be the man he became, not in a bank, and not on a train. He would learn it in a war that had no rules at all. If you want to understand Jesse James, you have to understand that he came of age inside the worst violence the American Civil War ever produced. Not the great set-piece battles, not Gettysburg or Antietam, with their flags and their generals. Something far uglier, something with no front line and no quarter. Missouri was a border state, a slave state that did not secede, a place where neighbors fell on opposite sides and stayed neighbors, which is to say they knew exactly where each other lived. And in the western counties along the Kansas line, the war curdled into a guerrilla conflict so savage that it shocked even the men fighting the conventional war elsewhere. There were the Jayhawkers, Unionist raiders out of Kansas who'd been burning and looting pro-slavery Missouri for years before the war even officially began. And there were the Bushwhackers, the Confederate guerrillas of Missouri, who answered raid with raid, ambush with ambush, murder with murder. This is the world Frank James rode into first. He joined the Bushwhackers. By 1863, he was riding with William Quantrill, and Quantrill's name is written in blood in American history because of one day in August of that year when his raiders descended on the town of Lawrence, Kansas, and methodically murdered around 150 men and boys in the streets and in front of their families. The Lawrence Massacre. Frank was there. Jesse, at 15, was not. He was still considered too young. Not for long. In the spring of 1864, the Union militia came to the Samuel farm looking for information about the Bushwhackers. What happened there is one of the moments that forged Jesse. The accounts vary in their details, but the core is consistent and brutal. The soldiers beat young Jesse, and they strung up his stepfather, Dr. Samuel, by the neck from a tree, hauling him up and letting him down, again and again, trying to choke a confession out of him about where the guerrillas were hiding. Reuben Samuel survived, but he was never the same. The repeated near hanging is thought to have left him with permanent brain damage. Jesse was 16. Soon after, he joined the Bushwhackers himself. And not just any band. He rode with William Anderson, a man so violent that history remembers him by the name his own side gave him. Bloody Bill. I want to be careful here, because you're trying to sleep, and this part of the story does not want to be gentle. But you can't sail past it, because everything Jesse became flows from it. Anderson's men did not take prisoners in any meaningful sense. They killed the wounded. They scalped the dead. Some of them tied the scalps of Union soldiers to their saddles and the bridles of their horses, like grim decorations. They fought to terrorize. And the boy from the church-going family in Clay County learned his trade among them. In September of 1864, near a town called Centralia, Anderson's guerrillas stopped a train, pulled off about 24 unarmed Union soldiers, many of them going home on leave, and shot them. Then, when a Union force came in pursuit, the Bushwhackers ambushed and slaughtered them too. More than 100 men killed in a single day, many of them after they'd surrendered or fallen. The Centralia massacre. Jesse was there. By some accounts, he was credited with killing the Union commander in the fighting. He was 17 years old. Let that settle. Before he was old enough to vote, before he had ever robbed a bank, Jesse James had ridden through one of the most merciless campaigns of the entire war, in a band that mutilated the dead, in a state where surrender often just meant you'd be shot kneeling instead of standing. And here's the thing I keep coming back to, lying awake with this story. There is no version of a boy who lives through that and comes out the other side unmarked. The guerrilla war was not soldiering as we usually imagine it. No long marches, no orderly lines, no clear beginning or end to a battle. It was ambush and reprisal. It was knowing the men you killed, and knowing they'd kill your family if they got the chance first. It was a world with the bottom torn out of it, where mercy got you killed and the only law was loyalty to your own. A boy raised in church who'd memorized scripture at his mother's table, learned in that world that human life was cheap and vengeance was holy, and the rules everyone else lived by simply did not apply to men like him. You don't unlearn that at 18. You don't unlearn it at 30. He carried that war inside him to the very last morning of his life, the way some men carry shrapnel that the surgeons could never quite reach. Bloody Bill Anderson was killed in an ambush not long after Centralia, shot down by Union militia, and the bands he'd led began to scatter as the Confederacy collapsed around them. And in the last gasp of the war, in the spring of 1865, Jesse was shot in the chest, a serious wound near the lung, as he tried, by some accounts, to surrender under a flag of truce. He nearly died of it. He was carried home, bleeding and feverish, to be nursed slowly back to life by the women of his family, among them the young cousin he would one day marry. And here's the thing about that wound, and that war, and that boyhood among killers. The war ended. For Jesse James, in a way that matters enormously. It never did. He was a teenager who had known almost nothing of adult life except riding, hiding, ambush, and killing. He had watched his stepfather hanged in his own yard. He had ridden with men who scalped their enemies. He had been shot down by his own telling while trying to lay down his arms. And then he was told that the cause was lost. The slaves were freed. The South was beaten. And he was to go home and become a peaceful farmer in a Missouri now governed by the very people he'd spent years fighting. He did not, and perhaps could not, do that. The skills he had were the skills of the bushwhacker. The grievances he carried were bottomless, and the country he came home to felt, to him and many like him, like occupied territory. Rest now if you can, even after all that. The hardest part of the story is behind us. But keep that wounded boy in your mind, lying in the farmhouse, healing slowly, nursed by his cousin Z. Because the war ended for everyone else. For Jesse, it just changed its name. Here the myth and the man pull hard against each other, and it's worth slowing down to feel the strain. The legend wants Jesse James to be a kind of social rebel, a champion of the common man, someone fighting the banks and the railroads on behalf of the little people they crushed. In the modern imagination, he gets sanded down into something almost progressive, the people's outlaw, sticking it to the powerful. The real Jesse James was something much harder to romanticize. He was, first and last, an unreconstructed Confederate. A man who never accepted the outcome of the war, never recanted the cause, never let go of the side he'd bled for as a boy. His loyalties were Southern, and they were tribal, and they ran to the bone. When he robbed, he often robbed banks and railroads tied, in his mind and in the minds of his sympathizers, to the Republican, Northern, Reconstruction order that now ruled Missouri. The robberies weren't charity. They were in part a continuation of the war by other means. Revenge, with a cash incentive. And his faith was real. That's one of the genuinely strange notes in the chord of his character. This was a man who had killed, who would kill again, and who also took his religion seriously his entire life. He'd been baptized. He sang hymns. Late in his outlaw years, he was a member of a Baptist church. He could quote scripture. There is something deeply unsettling about a man who could rob a train one season and sit in a pew the next, and apparently feel no contradiction in it at all, because in his own framework, perhaps, there wasn't one. He was a soldier of a defeated nation, a defender of his family and his people, doing what war required. The Old Testament is full of righteous violence. He seems to have read himself into that story. What did he believe then in the end? He believed the South had been wronged. He believed the men who'd beaten his family and hanged his stepfather had never paid for it. He believed loyalty was everything, to kin, to comrades, to the old cause. He believed, it seems, in his own righteousness, with a conviction that never cracked. He did not, as far as the record shows, believe in giving his money to the poor. He believed in keeping it. The men he rode with were not idealists. They were former guerrillas, hard cases. His brother Frank and the younger brothers, and a rotating cast of others. Men forged in the same fire, carrying the same grudges, comfortable with the same violence. This was a band held together by blood and war and shared bitterness, not by any creed about helping the downtrodden. And yet, I don't want to make him a cartoon either. because that's its own kind of laziness. He was capable of charm. People who met him often liked him. He was funny by accounts, quick and warm in conversation, generous to those inside his circle. He doted on his children. He loved his wife. He could be tender in private letters. He was not a monster wearing a man's face. He was something more disquieting, an ordinary, sociable, religious man who had learned, young and thoroughly, that some people simply needed killing, and who never unlearned it. That's the belief underneath all the others, really. The conviction, born in the war, that violence was a legitimate tool, that the rules other men lived by had been suspended for him long ago, and never reinstated. The legend gives him a noble cause. The truth gives him a wound that never closed, dressed up afterward in the language of nobility by men who had reasons of their own to dress it. We'll meet one of those men soon. He's the one who took a violent Confederate ex-guerrilla and turned him in newsprint into a knight. But first, before the myth, before the man with the pen, there was the work itself, the robberies, the thing he actually did, day to day, year to year, that gave the legend something to grow on. Let's ride out with the gang for a while, quietly, from a distance, and watch what the trade really looked like. So they came home from the war, and they did not lay down their guns. We've said that already. But what did they actually do with them? What did the outlaw life look like, stripped of the music the ballads later set it to? It began, most likely, with banks. In February of 1866, in the town of Liberty, Missouri, a band of men robbed the Clay County Savings Association in broad daylight and rode off with a fortune in cash and bonds. It may have been the first daylight, peacetime armed bank robbery in American history, a new kind of crime for a country still raw from war. And it was marked, as so many of these would be, by a senseless death. A young man named George Wymore, a student, gunned down in the street as the robbers fled. He had nothing to do with anything. He was simply there. Whether Jesse himself rode in that first robbery is honestly uncertain. Historians have argued it for generations. But within a few years there was no ambiguity at all about what the James brothers and their friends the Youngers were doing. They were robbing. Steadily. Boldly. And then, around the start of the 1870s, they reached for something new. Something that would change the legend forever. They started robbing trains. The first one came in July of 1873 in Iowa at a lonely spot near a town called Adair. It was the gang's first train robbery, the first ever west of the Mississippi River by many accounts, and it set the pattern for the terror that followed. They didn't simply flag the train down. They pried loose a rail and rigged it with a rope, and when the locomotive came through in the dark, they yanked the track out from under it. The engine left the rails and toppled, and the engineer, a man named John Rafferty, was crushed and killed in the wreck. Sit with that for a moment, because it tells you something the dime novels never would. The very first train robbery in their famous career began with an innocent railroad man dead in the twisted iron of his own engine. There was nothing gallant in it. It was a derailment, with a body in it, followed by men with masks moving through the cars taking what they could. After Adair, they had a taste for it. And the train robberies, more than the banks, are what built the legend, because trains were dramatic, public, and aimed at an institution that ordinary people genuinely loathed. In January of 1874, at a backwoods Missouri station called Gad's Hill, the gang took over the entire tiny depot, then stopped the train and robbed it at their leisure. And here you can see, just for a moment, the showmanship that made them famous. By some accounts, the robbers had a kind of theatrical flair. There's a story, often repeated, that they handed the conductor a prepared press release describing the robbery with a blank left for the amount stolen, so the newspapers could get the details right. True or embroidered, it captures something real about the gang's instinct for spectacle. They understood, even then, that the story mattered, that how the robbery was told would outlast the money. There was a robbery at a place sometimes called Rocky Cut near Otterville, Missouri, in 1876. A train held up, the express safe emptied of a substantial haul. There were stagecoaches. There were more banks. Across a decade, the gang ranged over Missouri and beyond, into Iowa, Kentucky, West Virginia, Texas, eventually all the way to Minnesota, and the legend ranged right along with them, growing fat. But picture what these robberies actually were for the people inside them. A train rolling through the dark, a sudden stop, a jolt, shouting, masked men with revolvers moving down the aisle, passengers, farmers, traveling families, salesmen, women and children, ordered to hand over their watches and their wallets and their rings while a gun hung in the lamplight. The express messenger in his car, alone, being forced to open the safe or face the consequences. This is the texture the Robin Hood story leaves out. The gang did sometimes pass over the ordinary passengers and concentrate on the express safe, and that detail got spun later into the myth that they only ever robbed the rich railroad and never the common folk. But the terror was real, and it fell on whoever happened to be aboard. And the money. The money did not go to widows and orphans. It went to the gang. It funded the hiding, the horses, the lying low between jobs, the support of a network of sympathizers. There is, I'll say it again because it matters, no credible record of Jesse James systematically giving his stolen money to the poor. The charity is the part of the legend with the least evidence behind it. And it's the part people love best. What there was, instead, was a kind of arrogance that thrilled the public, the sheer nerve of it. The way the gang seemed to come and go as it pleased, robbing in daylight, vanishing into a countryside full of friends, mocking the lawmen and the detectives who couldn't lay a hand on them. In a hard decade, for people who hated the banks and the railroads, that nerve felt like justice, even when it was only theft. They didn't need Jesse to give them money. They just needed him to humiliate the powerful. And he did that beautifully. The men hunting the gang grew more and more frustrated. The railroads and the express companies wanted it stopped. And so they turned to the most famous detective agency in the country, the Pinkertons, and told them to end it by whatever means worked. The Pinkertons tried. They failed, again and again, because the James Younger network was simply too deep, too loyal, too rooted in the old bushwhacker country where everyone was kin to someone and no one would talk. And out of that frustration came the worst decision any of Jesse's enemies ever made. A decision that would turn the whole tide of public feeling and hand the outlaw a kind of victory no robbery ever could. It happened on a cold night in January of 1875, at the family farm, with a flash of fire through a window and a child who should never have been part of any of it. If you want to know why so many ordinary Missourians loved an outlaw, you have to know what happened at the Samuel farm in January of 1875. By then, the gang had been at it for years, as you've seen. Liberty, Adair, Gadd's Hill, all of it. And the men hired to stop them had run out of patience and out of ideas. The Pinkertons had a maddening problem. The James boys were protected by a wall of family and former bushwhacker sympathizers across western Missouri who hid them, fed them, lied for them, and sent word ahead whenever a stranger came asking questions. Catching them was like trying to grab a handful of smoke off the surface of a creek. So they decided to stop being patient. So, on a cold night in late January 1875, Pinkerton agents surrounded the Samuel family farmhouse, believing Jesse and Frank were inside. They weren't. The agents threw an incendiary device through the window, a metal canister meant to light up the room, to flush out the men they thought were hiding there. Accounts have long argued about exactly what it was and what it was meant to do. What is not in dispute is the result. The device exploded. Inside that house was Zerelda, the fierce mother, and her children, including a little boy named Archie. Archie Peyton Samuel, Jesse's young half-brother, a child, 8 or 9 years old. The blast tore Archie open. He died of his wounds, and it shattered Zerelda's right arm so badly that part of it had to be amputated. A child killed, a mother maimed, in their own home, by detectives hunting 2 men who weren't even there. You can imagine what that did. It was, for the public relations war around Jesse James, a catastrophe, for the Pinkertons, for the railroads, for the whole apparatus arrayed against the outlaw. Overnight, the gang's sympathizers had their proof. Look what they do, they said. Look who the real criminals are. They will burn a house down around a grandmother and a little boy. The Pinkertons had handed Jesse James the most powerful gift an outlaw can receive, the appearance of a victim. There were even efforts in the Missouri legislature after this to grant the James brothers something like amnesty, a measure of how the sympathy ran. It failed, narrowly. But the fact that it was seriously considered tells you everything about how the public mood had shifted. And Zerelda. Oh, Zerelda made the most of it. For the rest of her long life she would stand on the porch of that farm, the stump of her arm a visible wound, and tell visitors the story of the night the detectives killed her baby and crippled her. She never stopped. She turned her grief into legend with both hands, the one she had and the one she'd lost. So here is something the myth gets at least partly right. By accident. There was real cruelty done to the James family. Jesse's stepfather hanged in the yard during the war. His little half-brother killed by a Pinkerton firebomb. His mother mutilated. These things genuinely happened. They are not invented. But notice the sleight of hand the legend performs. It takes those real wounds and uses them to wash everything else clean. The murdered bank teller, the shot bystanders, the terrorized train passengers, the killings, All of it gets folded into a story about a wronged family fighting back. The grief was real. The grief was also, in the hands of his defenders, a tool. A child died in that house. Hold on to that, even as you grow heavy with sleep. Because in this whole legend of dashing rides and clever robberies, the truest victims were almost always the ones nobody put in the dime novels. Archie was 9. Now, let me tell you about the man who knew exactly how to turn a story like that into gold. His name was John Newman Edwards. You won't find him in the movies. He never robbed a thing. He carried a pen, not a pistol. And yet, more than any robbery, more than any gunfight, John Newman Edwards is the reason you've heard of Jesse James at all. Edwards was a newspaperman, a Confederate veteran himself, a former cavalry officer, a man left bitter and grieving by the South's defeat, and a writer of enormous, florid, romantic talent. He was an editor in Kansas City and elsewhere, and he had a cause. He wanted to vindicate the defeated Confederacy. He wanted to turn the men who'd fought its dirtiest war, the bushwhackers, the guerrillas, into heroes. He wanted to tell the world that the South had produced not criminals, but cavaliers, knights brought low by a corrupt and vindictive North. And in Jesse James, he found his perfect subject. Edwards wrote about Jesse the way a poet writes about a doomed prince. He cast the robberies as acts of daring and defiance. He cast Jesse and Frank as gallant Confederate soldiers who'd never been allowed to come home in peace, driven to outlawry by a society that hounded them. He wrote editorials. He helped place letters supposedly from Jesse himself, protesting his innocence, declaring his grievances, full of wounded Southern dignity. Whether Jesse wrote every word or Edwards polished them hardly matters. Together they were composing a character. There's a famous piece Edwards wrote after one of the gang's most audacious train robberies that he gave a title worthy of its ambition, something about the chivalry of crime. In it, he compared the outlaws to figures out of legend and old romance, knights of the road, insisting that men like this belonged not in a criminal court but in a ballad, that they were too grand, too bold, too splendid for the squalid, money-grubbing age they were unlucky enough to live in. He didn't deny the robberies. He elevated them. He took the plain, ugly fact of armed men frightening passengers on a train and dressed it in the language of King Arthur. It is purple, overheated, shameless, and, you have to admit it, magnificent propaganda. And people ate it up. That's the trick when you look at it closely. Edwards never argued that Jesse hadn't done the things he was accused of. He argued that the things were beautiful. That a country grown grey and commercial and corrupt should be grateful, almost, for the last few wild men who still had the nerve to ride out and take what they wanted in the grand old style. It was nostalgia disguised as journalism, a lament for the Old South smuggled into the news pages under a mask, and for a wounded, defeated population that wanted desperately to believe its lost war had been noble. It landed like rain on dry ground. This is the engine of the legend. Not Jesse's deeds. His deeds were robbery and murder. The legend was a deliberate literary creation, built by a grieving Confederate editor who needed a hero, working on a public that was hungry to believe the men who'd lost the war hadn't really been the villains after all. And the timing was perfect. The 1870s were hard years for ordinary farmers. The railroads were genuinely hated, for their land grabs, their price gouging, their arrogance. The banks were distrusted. So when Edwards painted Jesse as the man who struck back at the railroads and the banks on behalf of the common Southerner, he was lighting a fire in very dry grass. People wanted an avenger. He gave them one, in beautiful prose, week after week. The dime novelists took it from there. They didn't care about Confederate vindication. They cared about selling booklets. So they took Edwards's romantic cavalier and turned him into pure adventure. The daring, the disguises, the narrow escapes, the noble outlaw who only robbed those who deserved it. The Robin Hood part, the giving to the poor part, swelled up in the retelling like bread dough. By the time it was through rising, the actual man underneath had nearly disappeared. Here's what the myth exaggerated plainly: the nobility, the charity, the clean kills, the political cause as something grand rather than something bitter. The idea that he was beloved everywhere, when in truth Missouri was deeply, angrily divided about him. For every sympathizer, there was a citizen who wanted him dead and the trains to run safely. And here's what got quietly written out: the dead bystanders, the first cousin nature of his marriage, which we'll come to, and which sits oddly with the romantic frame. The fact that the gang's later years were a long, grim, fearful decline rather than a string of triumphs. The simple, unglamorous truth that robbing trains is terrifying for the unarmed people on the train, and that the railroad they were robbing was, in practice, often just frightened passengers and a clerk in an express car. John Newman Edwards, by the way, stayed loyal to the end and beyond. When Jesse died, Edwards would help arrange Frank's surrender on favorable terms and would champion the family's cause for years. He believed in the legend he'd helped build. Maybe that's the most human thing about him. But understand what it means. The Jesse James in your head, the charming Robin Hood, was, to a remarkable degree, written into existence by a man with a pen, and a wound, and an agenda. The real one was about to ride into the worst day of his life. A small town in Minnesota, a bank with thick walls, and citizens who, unlike the legend, did not love Jesse James at all. Every legend needs a fall. Jesse James had several, but the great one, the one from which the gang never recovered, happened on the 7th of September, 1876, in Northfield, Minnesota. By 1876, the James Younger gang was at the height of its fame, and though they may not have fully felt it, near the end of its run. The decision to go all the way north to Minnesota is itself revealing. Missouri had grown hot for them. Too many lawmen, too many Pinkertons, too much of the population souring on the killings. So they looked far afield for a fat, soft, unsuspecting target. The gang that rode into Northfield numbered 8. Jesse and Frank James, Cole, Jim, and Bob Younger, the 3 younger brothers, longtime partners of the James boys, bound to them by war and crime and kinship, and 3 others, Clell Miller, Bill Chadwell, and Charlie Pitts. Their target was the First National Bank of Northfield. The plan was the usual one. A few men inside to take the money, the rest outside to control the street and cover the escape. Quick, loud, gone. It went wrong almost immediately. And it went wrong because of the one thing the legend never accounts for. The ordinary people refused to play their part. Inside the bank, the staff would not cooperate. The acting cashier, a man named Joseph Lee Haywood, was ordered to open the safe. He refused, telling them, by the accounts that survive, that it was on a time lock and could not be opened, which may or may not have been true. He would not do it. The robbers threatened him, struck him, held a knife to him. He still would not open it. For his courage, he was murdered, shot down behind his own counter. He left a wife and a young daughter. Remember his name too, alongside little Archie's, Joseph Lee Haywood. The legend has no room for him, but he is one of the truest men in the whole story. Outside, the town came alive. This is the part the dime novels could never quite explain away. The citizens of Northfield did not cower. They realized what was happening, and they fought. Men grabbed rifles and shotguns from the hardware store. They took position in windows and doorways up and down the street, and they began to shoot the outlaws off their horses. It became a slaughter, and the gang was on the wrong end of it. Clell Miller, dead in the street. Bill Chadwell, dead. The Youngers shot to pieces. Bob's elbow shattered. Jim shot through the face. Cole hit again and again. A local Swedish immigrant named Nicholas Gustafsson, who reportedly didn't understand the English shouts to clear the street, was shot and killed too. Another bystander. Another name the legend forgets. What survived of the gang fled town in ruins. And then came the manhunt, and it was unlike anything they'd ever faced in Missouri. Back home, the gang could vanish into friendly country, into the homes of cousins and old comrades, into a landscape that closed around them like water around a stone. Minnesota was not friendly country. It was hostile ground, full of people with no love for Southern outlaws, and it rose against them. Telegraph wires carried the alarm in every direction. Special trains brought lawmen and volunteers. Newspapers printed descriptions. By some counts, 1,000 men, more, went out into the wet September countryside to hunt the survivors. The reward notices went up. The whole region became a net. And the weather turned against them. It rained and rained. The fugitives, several of them shot through and bleeding, moved at night through bottomland and marsh and dripping woods, soaked to the skin, hungry, exhausted, hiding in thickets by day while search parties beat the brush nearby. They stole horses and lost them. They begged or seized food from isolated farms. 2 weeks of this, 2 weeks of being slowly run down across a strange, cold, waterlogged land that wanted them dead. Somewhere in that misery, the brothers split from the Youngers. The famous bitter story, never fully provable but long believed, is that the badly wounded Bob Younger was slowing the group, and that Jesse, ruthless even now, argued for leaving him behind. Or worse. The Youngers would not abandon their brother. Whatever the precise words spoken in that wet darkness, the partnership of James and Younger ended there, in that flight, and it never reformed. Years of riding together, war and robbery and shared blood, finished in an argument in a swamp. The Youngers, Cole, Jim and Bob, traveling now with Charlie Pitts, were finally cornered in a marsh near the town of Madelia. a posse closed in. In the gunfight that followed, Charlie Pitts was killed. The three younger brothers, between them carrying a horrifying number of fresh wounds, surrendered. They were taken, tried, and, choosing to plead guilty, which spared them the gallows, sent to the Minnesota State Penitentiary at Stillwater. Bob Younger would die there of tuberculosis some years later, still a young man. Cole and Jim would serve long, grinding sentences before their eventual release into a changed world. Frank and Jesse somehow slipped through the net. They made it back south, but they came back as something diminished. The gang was gone. The Youngers were in prison or dead. The aura of invincibility had been shot off them in a single afternoon by a town full of shopkeepers and farmers who simply would not be robbed. That's the biggest failure. Not just a robbery gone bad, though it went as badly as a robbery can go. The deeper failure was the failure of the myth itself, tested against reality and found hollow. The legend said the people loved Jesse James. Northfield said, not these people. Not when it's their bank, their cashier, their street. These people grabbed their guns and shot the legend full of holes. After Northfield, the man who'd ridden through the Centralia massacre and 100 robberies became mostly something he'd never been. He became a man in hiding, a man trying and failing to be ordinary. And it's in those last quiet years that we find the part of Jesse James the legend almost entirely forgot. Let's leave the gunsmoke now. The night is deep, and the rest of this story is quieter and sadder and more human than anything the ballads ever sang. Because here is what gets forgotten almost completely in the legend of the dashing outlaw. Jesse James was a husband and a father, and for the last years of his life, he was mostly just a frightened man trying to keep his family safe under a false name. He married for love. That's not a thing the legend dwells on, but it's true. His wife was Zerelda Mims, called Z, and she was his first cousin, named, like his mother, for the same family matriarch. She had nursed him back to health years earlier from that near-fatal chest wound at the end of the war. They courted for the better part of a decade, in secret and at a distance, while he lived the outlaw life. They married in 1874. By every account, it was a genuine and devoted marriage, and Z knew exactly who and what she was marrying, and chose him anyway, and stayed. They had children. A son, Jesse Edwards James, named, tellingly, partly after John Newman Edwards, the man who'd built the myth. A daughter, Mary. There were twins, too, who died in infancy. A private grief folded into a life already full of them. And Jesse, the terror of the railroads, was by all accounts a tender and doting father. He played with his children. He fretted over them. He wanted, more than anything in those last years, to give them a normal life. He could not. That was the trap he'd built for himself. After Northfield, the family moved often, lived under aliases, kept to themselves. By the early 1880s, they had settled in St. Joseph, Missouri, in a small house on a hill, and Jesse was calling himself Thomas Howard, Mr. Howard, a respectable man, a cattle dealer, a churchgoer, a husband with a wife and 2 small children. The neighbors had no idea. Mr. Howard was pleasant. Mr. Howard kept to himself. Imagine the strain of it. The constant watching. The way every knock at the door, every stranger in town, every glance held too long, might mean the end. He slept, it said, with weapons close. He trusted almost no one. The web of loyal ex-bushwhackers that had once protected him had thinned out over the years, to prison, to graves, to ordinary lives, to the slow erosion of a lost cause that fewer and fewer people were willing to die for. Think about what that life cost, in the small hours. There's a particular loneliness to a man who can never quite be known by the people right beside him. The neighbors waved to Mr. Howard over the fence. The grocer chatted with Mr. Howard about the weather and the price of cattle. And Mr. Howard smiled and answered, and walked home up the hill carrying a secret so heavy it could hang him. A name that, if spoken once in the wrong room, would bring the whole world down on his children's heads. He could not relax. He could not boast. The most famous outlaw in America had to spend his days being utterly, perfectly forgettable. And the effort of that performance, day after day, year after year, must have ground something down in him. You can be lonely in a full house. You can be lonely with a wife who loves you and children who climb into your lap. If the truest fact about you is one you can never let slip even there. He tried to put a new gang together for a few last jobs, but the old reliable men were gone. He was reduced to recruiting from a poorer, younger, less trustworthy pool. And that, in the end, is what killed him. Not a posse, not a shootout, not a Pinkerton. The legend always wanted a grand death for him, a blaze, a last stand, the cornered wolf going down with both guns blazing. What he got was a couple of small-time hungry young men who saw in the great Jesse James mostly a reward. The forgotten. Jesse is the one in that little house in St. Joseph. Mr. Howard, dusting the parlor with his pistols laid aside because he trusted the two young men sitting in his front room. A man of 34 who had been at war, in one form or another, since he was 16. Tired, probably. Famous beyond reason, and unable to enjoy a minute of it. Loved by his wife. Adored by his children. Hunted by everyone else. That's the man. Not the cavalier of the editorials. Not the Robin Hood of the dime novels. A frightened, devoted, dangerous, exhausted husband, living under a borrowed name, waiting for the knock that never quite came, because the danger, in the end, was already inside the house. Stay with him a moment longer. The morning of the 3rd of April, 1882, was warm. He'd taken off his coat. And because a man can't go about armed in his own parlor in front of company without looking like an outlaw, he'd unbuckled his guns and set them down. He noticed a picture on the wall was crooked or dusty. The accounts differ on the small detail. He stood on a chair to fix it, his back to the room. And that is when the war that had started for him in 1864, in a yard in Clay County, finally caught up to him. The two young men in the parlor that morning were the Ford brothers, Charlie Ford, and his younger brother Robert. Bob Ford was about 20 years old. They had thrown in with Jesse's last threadbare attempt at a gang. But Bob Ford had also been doing something else, quietly, he'd been in contact with the governor of Missouri, Thomas Crittenden. Crittenden had made the destruction of Jesse James a personal political mission. The railroads wanted the outlawry ended, and Crittenden had effectively put a price on Jesse's head and let it be known that the man who delivered him would be rewarded and protected. Bob Ford decided to collect. We don't know everything about the arrangement, but the shape of it is clear enough. Ford had reached an understanding with the governor. He would betray Jesse. And on that warm April morning, sitting in the house in St. Joseph, with Jesse's coat off and his guns set aside and his back turned to fix that picture on the wall, Bob Ford drew his pistol and shot Jesse James in the back of the head. He died at once, 34 years old, in his own parlor, in front of his wife, who came running at the sound. The terror of the West, who had survived guerrilla war and a chest wound and 100 robberies and Northfield and years of hiding, killed, unarmed, from behind, by a frightened 20-year-old who wanted the reward. What happened next is one of the great strange chapters of American crime. The Fords didn't flee. They expected to be hailed as heroes. Bob Ford even telegraphed the authorities to announce what he'd done. And then both brothers were promptly arrested, indicted for murder, and within a single day pleaded guilty and were sentenced to hang. And then, within hours, Governor Crittenden pardoned them. Read that again, in the quiet of the night. They confessed to murder, were sentenced to death, and were pardoned the same day by the very governor who had arranged the killing. It was, in effect, a state-sponsored assassination, and everyone knew it, and that knowledge changed everything. Because here is the final, beautiful irony of the whole story. In the moment Bob Ford pulled that trigger, he did the one thing guaranteed to immortalize the man he killed. He turned Jesse James, the robber, the murderer, the unrepentant Confederate, into a victim. A man shot in the back, unarmed, in front of his family, by a coward who'd taken his hospitality and a governor's blood money. Public reaction was ferocious. Not relief, fury. The manner of the killing offended people far beyond Jesse's circle of sympathizers. It seemed dishonorable, low, treacherous. Within weeks there was a ballad spreading across the country, and its most famous line buried Bob Ford forever. That dirty little coward who shot Mr. Howard and laid poor Jesse in his grave. That's how the country chose to remember it. Not Jesse the killer, Jesse the betrayed. And the man who'd actually pulled the trigger, who'd hoped to be a hero, became the eternal symbol of cowardly treachery. There's a detail here so strange it almost beggars belief. The Ford brothers, sensing that the only thing of value they now possessed was the killing itself, took it on the road. They appeared on stage in a touring show, reenacting the assassination of Jesse James, night after night, for paying audiences. Bob Ford, playing himself, raising the pistol, again and again, in front of the curtain. Imagine the weight of that. Performing the worst thing you ever did for coins, to crowds who came partly to see it, and partly to hiss at you. It hollowed them out. Charlie Ford, the older brother, broke under it, sick, addicted to morphine for his ailments, haunted by what they'd done, and within 2 years of the killing, he took his own life. Bob carried on a while longer, drifting ever westward, his name a curse in every town, until that bullet finally found him in the Colorado saloon. The shooter of Jesse James, shot down in turn, in a tent of a building in a silver mining town, far from anywhere that remembered him kindly. There's a grim poetry in it that no novelist would dare invent. Jesse's body was taken back to the family farm, and Zerelda, fierce, grieving, unbreakable Zerelda, buried her son in the yard of the home where he'd grown up, so she could watch over the grave herself. She had words carved into the headstone calling him murdered, naming the treachery, refusing to let the manner of his death be softened. She charged visitors a small fee to see the grave. She sold pebbles from the gravesite as souvenirs. And when she ran low, the story goes, she'd quietly restock from a nearby creek. She mourned him, and she marketed him, in the same breath, because she was that kind of indomitable, and because the legend was, by then, very nearly the family's only remaining inheritance. The man was gone. The myth was just getting started. So what's left? When the gun smoke clears, and the grave is dug, and the ballad has been sung 1,000 times. What's left is everything we started with. The legend. Bigger now than ever, fed by the manner of his death, polished by every generation that came after. Frank James. Quiet Frank, the Shakespeare-quoting brother, outlived Jesse by more than 30 years. After Jesse's death, Frank made a remarkable decision. He surrendered. He walked into the governor's office, unbuckled his gun belt, and handed it over, declaring that he was tired of running, tired of hiding, tired of the life. And then came the truly astonishing part. He was tried and acquitted. Twice, in fact, for different crimes. Missouri juries, full of men who still carried Confederate sympathies and a deep ambivalence about the whole bloody saga, simply would not convict him. Frank lived out a long, strange, oddly gentle old age. He worked as a doorman at a theater, as a shoe salesman, as a telegraph operator, as a starter at a horse racing track. And, this is almost too perfect, for a time he gave tours of the family farm, the very place where his brother was buried, charging visitors to walk the ground where the legend was born. The last of the great outlaws in his quiet years, became a tour guide to his own myth. He died in 1915 in the same farmhouse where it had all begun. An old man of 72 who had outlived the entire era he belonged to. Zerelda lived a long time too, dying in 1911, having spent decades as the fierce keeper of her son's flame. The maimed mother on the porch, telling and retelling and selling the story to anyone who came up the lane. And the legend itself. It only grew. The dime novels became stage plays. The stage plays became, in the next century, films, dozens of them, generations of handsome actors playing Jesse as hero, as anti-hero, as tragic rebel, almost never as the man he actually was. He became a fixed star in the American imagination, the template for the romantic outlaw, the noble bandit, the rebel who dies young and beautiful and betrayed. The hunger for him never really faded. There were tourists at the grave within days of the burial, and there have been tourists in one form or another ever since. There were men who came forward decades later claiming to be Jesse James himself, insisting the killing in St. Joseph had been a hoax, that another man's body had been buried in his place, that the real Jesse had lived on in secret into ripe old age. One such claimant kept the story going almost to the middle of the next century, and people wanted to believe him. Because that is what we do with the figures we've turned into myth. We refuse to let them simply die in a parlor with a bullet in the back of the head. The legend resists the smallness of the real ending, so it invents survivals, secret identities, second lives. The body in the ground was eventually exhumed and tested more than a century on, and the science said what the history had always said, that it was him, that Bob Ford's bullet had done exactly what the ballad claimed. But by then, it hardly mattered. The myth had long since stopped needing the man's permission to exist. His house in St. Joseph still stands, moved and preserved, the bullet hole shown to visitors. The farm in Clay County where he was born and buried became in time a museum. People still go. They stand where he stood. They buy the postcards. They feel, I think, the pull of the story even when they half know it isn't true. Maybe especially then. The truth, meanwhile, sat quietly underneath, the way it usually does. The truth that he was not a Robin Hood and gave nothing meaningful to the poor. The truth that he was a slaveholder's son and an unrepentant Confederate to his last breath. The truth that he learned to kill in the most savage corner of a savage war, before he was old enough to shave. The truth that his robberies left real bodies in the street, a student in Liberty, a cashier in Northfield, an immigrant who didn't understand the shouting, others whose names barely survive. The truth that a little boy named Archie died in a firebombed farmhouse and a cashier named Haywood died defending a safe. And these were the people the story chose to forget. And the other truths, the human ones, that the legend also missed. That he loved a woman who knew exactly what he was and loved him anyway. That he doted on his children and grieved his lost twins and wanted at the end only to be left alone to be Mr. Howard. A man with a quiet house on a hill. That he died unarmed, with his back turned, fixing a picture on the wall, betrayed by a boy who wanted a reward. Here's the thing about myths. We don't build them because we're fooled. We build them because we need them. America in the 1870s needed an avenger for the defeated South and a champion against the hated railroads. And John Newman Edwards handed them one, beautifully written. The decades that followed needed a romantic rebel, and they kept the avenger and quietly dropped the politics and the bodies. Each generation took the Jesse James it needed, and let the rest sink into the creek behind the farmhouse, like Zerelda's souvenir pebbles. The real man is harder to love. He's harder to hate, too, if you sit with him long enough. The frightened boy in the burning state, the doting father under the false name, the believer who could sing hymns and rob trains and feel no seam between them. He contained more than the legend ever allowed. And he was also plainly a robber and a killer. And we shouldn't pretend otherwise to make the night more comfortable. The truth, as I said at the very beginning, lies somewhere in the spaces between the stories. Between the hero and the murderer. Between the cavalier of the editorials and the man dusting his parlor. Between what Missouri wanted to believe and what actually happened on those dusty streets. Jesse Woodson, James. Born on a slaveholding farm in 1847. Forged in the cruelest war America ever fought. Made into a myth by a grieving newspaperman. Broken at Northfield by a town that wouldn't kneel. Betrayed in his own home at 34. And then handed, by the manner of his death, the one thing he could never have robbed or earned, a kind of immortality. The man has been gone for well over a century now. Long buried. Long past all of it. The war, the running, the fear, the fame. But the legend rides on. It always will, because we keep needing it to. And that's where we'll leave him tonight, resting at last in the ground of the farm where he was born, watched over by a mother who never let him go. It's a strange thing to spend an evening with a man like this, to hold the killer and the father in the same thought, to see the boy in the burning state and the legend on the movie poster, and understand finally that they were always the same person, just told differently by people who needed different things from him. History is full of these doubled men. We smooth them into heroes or flatten them into villains because the truth that a person can be tender and terrible at once, devout and merciless, loved and lethal, is harder to hold than either story alone. But it's the truer thing. And there's a kind of peace, I find, in letting the real person be as complicated as he actually was, and then letting him go. So, let him go now. Let the farmhouse fade. Let the hemp fields and the dark trains and the wet Minnesota woods drift off into the soft grey distance where old stories live. Your day is done now too. There's nothing left to carry, no road left to ride, no watch to keep. Just the quiet and the dark and the slow, easy rhythm of your own breathing, in and out, carrying you down gently the way a slow river carries a leaf, without effort, without hurry, all the way down into sleep. Feel how heavy your body has become against the bed. Feel the day loosening its grip, one finger at a time. There is nothing you need to solve tonight. Nothing you need to remember. The story is told, and it will keep until you wake. Thank you for walking beside him with me tonight, through the hemp fields, and the gun smoke, and the long shadow of the myth. If this quiet kind of history helps you find your way to rest, you know where to find us. One sleepy soul at a time. Sleep well. We'll have another life to wander through, another night. Good night.